Welcome back, everyone, to another session of Frank Ravitch and Larry Becker talking law and religion and excerpts from the casebook, Law and Religion, Cases and Materials. Welcome back, everyone, and we are going today to talk science. There's nothing like a religion class to talk science, and we're going to talk science and ultimately creation, which is always my favorite. I love creation stories. Edwards versus Aquillard, with a nod to a smaller but more interesting case. It was like 100 and something pages long.
And that was edited down to less than half, more than half of that case, more than 60% of that case was edited out.
I would have edited,
no matter how much I edit, there's a lot. It's a very rich case, both factually and legally. There's a lot in Kitzmiller.
Well, that's right. That's right. So we're going to talk about them both. So Frank, talk to us about science. Talk to us about science and God, and talk to us why there is this insane mania in the West to separate theology from science.
Yeah, as someone who is not part of that movement to try to, separate, view the two things as somehow opposed to each other. I think that a lot of it, you hit it on the head there, right? A lot of this is about Western dualism and this idea that somehow science and religion have to conflict in some way, or if they don't have to, that at least they do in terms of creation. I think a lot of people are, and this is what creationists, creationists are a little more honest about this. It's intelligent designers who tend to be less honest about this. And so what really they don't want people to know about or think about is something called theistic evolution, which is really what many, if not most people who are religious believe. The Roman Catholic Church has openly recognized it. It's well accepted in Judaism and Islam and Buddhism, which is the idea that, evolution, science is real, science is real, science is proven, science is science. But you can still have a belief that God played a role in that, but you're not going to prove that scientifically. And so you're taking that on faith, and it doesn't have to conflict. You can accept science as accurate and true description of how things happened and still believe that God played a role in it somehow. But that is rejected in many parts of the US and in Australia and in some parts of Europe as well, by this sort of dualistic notion that you've got to believe that the world is 6,000 years old and reject science. And look, if you believe that, absolute respect to your belief, but the issue isn't whether you have a right to believe it. The issue in this case is whether you have a right to have it taught as science in the public schools.
There you go. The as science part.
Yeah.
Right. What we're dealing here are with origin stories. And the question is really the classification system of the West, onto which is imposed a constitutional separation between another set of classifications, religion and non-religion. Right.
Yeah. And theistic evolution is really almost ignored.
Right.
Right. This concept that you can have a non-conflict.
Right. But in a sense as well, one of the more interesting things was the strategic decision to tackle or to take on religion to take on science by interposing religion within science, and yet by not permitting in a comparative religion course to interpose science as the opposite of religion. So from a strategic perspective, these cases are really political in the sense, for example, it was very clear that you could teach you can teach the Bible, for example, as literature. You can teach origin stories. So one of the ways of dealing with this would have been to have a class on origin. and origin stories. You can have scientific origin stories. You can have in the context of the premises, principles, and working operations of science, and as far as they can take you, and then where they can't take you, and then you can have origin stories of religion. But worse than that, for me, certainly in Edwards and really in the Pennsylvania case, is that it's not science versus religion. It's science versus a particular religious perspective, because the people who are pushing this clearly were not thinking about neutrality among religions. If you're going to teach a religion version of origin stories, then you'd better put out a semester or two's worth of time, because you can't say, oh, yes, we should be able to do these origin stories, even assuming we don't do it in a science class, and then say, well, the only origin stories we're really going to look at is the one that comes from the Jewish and Christian Bibles, without looking at every other origin story with respect to which there is a representative religious community in the US.
Well, and even more narrow than that, because it's not, it's certainly within the Jewish tradition, there's a long tradition of rabbis saying, well, how long is a day, right? Accepting that the world could be very, very old, long before even modern science talked about that, and many Christian traditions. So it's not just narrow in the sense that it's within the biblical tradition. It's even more narrow than that. It's within a very narrow perspective from within the biblical traditions. And, think about, if you brought, 50 scientists together, and you ask them counterintuitively their views on religion or God, you might get 50 different answers. And yet these supposed scientists within the intelligent design movement all believe, just coincidentally, the same thing. We see that in the evidence in Kitzmiller. And, your point, I think, about Bible education classes or Bible as literature classes, not Bible education, Bible as literature or comparative religion. I mean, the courts have been clear, lower courts have talked about this. You can teach it, but you can't preach it. Yeah. Right. And so, yet in science, they're trying, the first to creation science movement, now the intelligent design movement, they're trying to bring in a particular view. And despite the fact that ID claims to not be religious, I mean, as we see in Kitzmiller, there's the Wedge document. There's tons of Barbara Forrest's finding the original manuscript of Pandas and People that was originally a creationist book, and they're just like, there's still some creation and God left in it, and they just forgot to change it to designer and design. In that kind of situation, I mean, I think what we see is, I wrote in a book, it's sort of a marketing scheme to try to get this in. But as you said, it's about, an origin story. You could teach a class on, as you said, on origin stories, but it wouldn't just be Christian or a narrow specific kind of Christian. It would be various religions, science, as you said. And evolution is not, ironically, despite the protestations of many people to the contrary, evolution doesn't talk about origins. Evolution is about what happens after the origin. Evolution, the intelligent designers frequently misuse the scientific meaning of the term theory, right? Theory in science is a very robust thing. Galaxy clustering is a theory. You can see it through telescopes. We know it's real, but it's a theory because there's questions of whether dark matter plays into it, things like that. So if something's a theory, it's a thing, it's real. But there may still be scientific debate about how it happens, but they tend to use, creation scientists and ideas tend to use the term theory in the way that scientists use the term hypothesis. Right. And so, origins debates within biochemistry are more in the hypothesis realm. I mean, they're burgeoning into more of what you would call a robust theory, but there's still tons of debate. Whereas evolution is a true scientific theory. There's not a question of whether it's real scientifically. There's just questions about various aspects of it. And
right.
so, you know,
Right.
but
And
it's not part of origins.
Right. And that has to be underlined. Quote unquote evolution is agnostic on origins, and it's agnostic on whether there's a driver. It is an observation from out of which predictions are made. And that can or need not be tied to any faith community or any larger interpretation of what it all means, right? And indeed, to derive meaning from it moves you out of science, out of the rationalization of facts and the ways to explain its operations with respect to itself, right? This self-reflexive, descriptive, and predictive process, it moves it into either the realms of philosophy, the realms of semiotics, the realms of theology, and therefore in and of itself, right, seems to be inapposite given the way in which we have classified and defined the difference between science and the scientific method, going back using the language that you've used, the difference between theory and hypothesis. I'm using it from a philosophical perspective, the difference between self-reflexive observation and prediction and the derivation versus the derivation of meaning, pattern, or signification on a broader scale. Two very different things to then force, and both of them can be taught in schools. That's the critical thing here. But it is clear if we're going to, I'm going to import Wallace here, if we're looking for intention, because we know they could both be taught, then why then to actually force cosmology into a scientific discourse when we know that scientific discourse of this kind is not cosmological, suggests or evidences an intention that is not to be included, but an intention to displace. And to displace.
Well, that's you know what we see in Edwards, right?
Right.
That's exactly what Edwards did. The goal was, you know, how do we wedge this into the science classrooms, right? That's what Edwards is, and ultimately the idea is, if not to displace completely, to distract maybe.
And it is a distraction because they're apples and oranges. It's on the one hand, you're looking at a fact-based, self-reflexive system of rationalizing the observable. In the other, you are leaping into an interpretive exercise, drawing from, but not limited to. The methodologies are fundamentally different. They are looking at very different things. And in that sense, to the extent that you actually take up the time of science within what is a cosmological, a theological, or philosophical exercise in taking facts and then moving them forward, you've actually disrupted the order that we have accepted as logical for the creation of pedagogically important distinctions among those areas that we're going to teach.
Well, that's the irony to it.
Right, and we can frame it. And of course, we can do whatever we want. We can make a hash of our pedagogy. The problem for those who want to do it in this case is that they are prevented precisely because of the limitations of the Establishment Clause. In this case, you can, had they wanted to make a hash of our education in any other way, people might have rolled their eyes and run away. But there'd be very little you can do except maybe replace the board. But here they cross the line, and it's a line that is of all of our makings, is a constitutional line.
Well, their path that they're taking within this sort of semiotic dialogue that you're talking about, what's interesting about that, and I think it's something that at a very deep theoretical level has caused them, ironically, extreme practical problems under the Establishment Clause. And that is that when when we look at the argument that's being made, that this, which of these things belongs in science, right? And the argument is that this metaphysical, cosmological inquiry that is not based on the scientific method somehow belongs in science. There are many religious traditions, most, in fact, religious traditions view these things as not together, and not, that you can have your cosmological, you can have your metaphysical beliefs in religion and accept science as science, and maybe even you don't believe that the science is correct or real. Maybe you believe there's something more to be revealed, but the reality is you can accept that these are two different modes of inquiry, and not try to wedge your cosmological, metaphysical concept into science. And the people who want to do that are frequently representing this small sliver, just even within Christianity, only a small sliver.
Right.
And so it's disturbing on a number of levels, but the response has not been to acknowledge that. The response has been the ID movement, which is to make things sound even more scientific, although they still are based on the same. Just because you use scientific terminology doesn't mean that you're doing science.
Right, which again goes back to intention, because they could have gotten their viewpoint across in a cosmology class or in a developing a pedagogy for origin stories in which you put it all in, or origin theories, whatever you want to call it. The fact that they refuse to do that suggests, if you apply the Wallace notion of looking at underlying intent, and that is to use a specific religion, which again also then implicates the neutrality principles that are now ever more deeply embedded, to displace science and the scientific method for a course on religious cosmology. But that brings up
and the Kitzmiller courts, Judge Jones, he sees that and he calls it what it is. He looks at the Wedge document, he looks at the other evidence, and he says, look, you're saying point blank in the Wedge document that your goal is to offset scientific materialism with, religious views. And so, it shouldn't be a shock that that's exactly what you're doing. The fact that you try to cloak the religious views in scientific terminology, and maybe take advantage of the fact that that a lot of Americans are not as well educated in science, perhaps, as we should be. That doesn't make it science, and so it's a big issue.
And let's make it more interesting. Let's make it more interesting now. All right. So here's the hypo. All right. We've now have Edwards, we have Kitzmiller, and we have a bunch of, let's say, angry people who find that science is abomination, and I'm using it in its religious sense. It's abomination, right? Free exercise clause. Can I demand in a jurisdiction that mandates that I be taught a certain set of courses? Can I demand that my children be allowed to skip science classes on the basis of my free exercise rights? That in fact, if they go in there, they will be forced to sully themselves, or to somehow repudiate or burden their souls or whatever, by coming into contact with this theory, and that therefore they should be allowed out for, I don't know, study hall or prayer and meditation, or to go out to some class somewhere else for proper instructions in what they view to be the correct framing of issues around this.
And courts have said, a number of lower courts have addressed that issue and said, you do have a right to be exempted from the class, but I'd have to go back and look to see the specifics. I don't think they're saying that means you get to go to a religion class. A lot of them say, just take another another class or study. You mentioned study hall, that kind of thing. You can go to a study hall. You could take another math class. If it's a school that has choices or options.
But wait, what if that is also on, what was it, the No Child Left Behind thing with a series of, you have to take a mandatory set of tests in order to pass, and part of the mandatory tests include questions that may relate to this thing that now you've used your free exercise rights to opt out of. Can you also then opt out of answering those questions, which requires you then to review the questions in advance, right? And then decide which questions are your child may not have to answer or be judged on in order to pass whatever exams you need in order to qualify for a high school diploma?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, because since the No Child Left Behind Act is, it's a federal law, so the federal RFRA would apply there. And so, it's a good question. I mean, I mean, theoretically, you could see an argument that there would have to be. I mean, I guess the government, might be able to argue that it would be, they have a compelling interest in having it standardized, and there's really no way other than keeping it standardized to be narrowly tailored to that. But I haven't seen that argument but I think theoretically, yeah, I agree with you. I think that's an argument that could be made. And then the question is, how far down the road do we go, right? I mean, what about exposure to the concept in a literature class, right?
There you go. That was where I was going next. That's where I was going next. Right, it's not just science. Some people may find, as they found in the 18th century, the study of English poetry of a certain kind to be offensive because it either speaks to or is not otherwise sufficiently condemning acts that are viewed as immoral, and therefore to read it and to discuss it would somehow be to acknowledge and signal acceptance of acts or ideas that they view as abhorrent. But if that's the case, then can you, on religious grounds, then be allowed not to be exposed to any idea that you might find abhorrent? And if that's the case, might you, if you take this far enough, and after 2020, and the free exercise cases, we may get here, does this mean that one might be able to do in the religion area what people have been attempting to do in the political arena, and that is to make it possible to go through an education system and be educated only with respect to those things that align with your own views? When translated into religious terms, the failure to do that will burden your religion and your practice of religion as you get educated.
I mean, I think, and there, bear in mind, the majority of states have state RFRAs, or their constitutions are interpreted that way. So it's theoretically possible. I think that it's a sort of be careful what you wish for situation, because, you look at what the state of Texas has done to public school curricula, and unfortunately, because it's a very powerful state in terms of the textbook buying market, they've actually led to a dumbing down or a
narrowing.
Just
we're not judgmental, a narrowing.
A narrowing what would be considered maybe factual understandings of history and science and things like that. But you could see people arguing it the other way, right? Which is not being able to be exposed to science violates my religious belief in theistic evolution, or not being able to learn the actual history of slavery and Jim Crow and racism in the U.S. And somehow belittling that and minimizing it violates my faith in my church that has taught that from that suffering, things can be wrought. And so, maybe over time, positive, not the positive things can arise because of that, but that strength can be built or whatever. If you look at the AME Church, there's some great teachings there, and you could see the argument, and in other churches as well. Well, the Texas ahistorical, watered down version of oppression against the African American community is a violation of my religious tenets, and therefore I have a religious right to be taught the actual real history. So, I mean, I think that on the one hand, it's very possible, but I think if the people, if they want to make those arguments to try to get out of things for religious reasons, they have to be aware that this is a two-way street. I mean, I think part of the problem here, and I know we've got about a minute and we've got to close. I think part of the problem here is that, and this is going more to your question, which is a natural, I think a very logical extension of the exemption question in terms of evolution and teaching evolution. And I think one of the problems that we have is that these arguments have become really culture war arguments.
Yep.
They've become highly political,
but now cast in the language of religion. Exactly.
And in some ways, in a way that I wrote in a book, even though if you can't tell, I got a pretty good science background. And so I happen to like science. I enjoy science. I love science a lot. I find it interesting. I know that may make me unusual and lost a little bit, but because I'm not an IP person who's got the great science background, maybe a PhD or something. But what I find is that by turning it into a culture war issue, it belittles religion and it belittles science, and the irony of it to me is that when we turn that into the exemption realm, now we're not exposing children to a wide range of things that will allow them to function in the world, and so, I'm very religious, but I trust myself to, we're obviously not, my tradition is not creationist or ID or, we theistic evolution or whatever, but I trust myself. If I was a creationist, I trust myself and, my religious institution to teach my children what I believe is the right. And the fact that they're exposed to something else it's not going to end that.
But now free exercise, as reinterpreted by our courts after 2020, suggests that the opposite is going to be true, that the power to make that determination is going to slip back from the state to either organized religion and its discipline over its members or to individuals themselves. All right, last question, and we got to end. So we move, and this is very interesting. So Aquillard actually in the 21st century is going to be a free exercise issue rather than an establishment issue.
Certainly theoretically could be, yeah.
Theoretically, that's right. So last question, and then we'll close. Can you support, is there a way of having Aquillard survive as an establishment clause case without lemon? Or entanglement?
I think Aquillard
endorsement, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I think Aquillard could survive without endorsement, but I think it's hard, right? If lemon and endorsement are gone, right? I guess the way you would show coercion of the Kennedy type, in indirect coercion, if lemon and endorsement are gone, that's probably your option. I guess the way you would do it would only be able to do it on an as applied basis. And so, you have to wait until in your school, the creation science comes up.
Right. Or you can argue neutrality, right? You You basically it this way, because the only way that you can be neutral towards all religion is to excise all religion from this and then have this placed somewhere else. Perhaps
that would be a way to do it. I think the problem is the court's neutrality, at least since the latter part of the 1990s, middle part of the 1990s, has been very much a formal neutrality. And so I think the question is,
right, but not in free
the
exercise.
justices promoting that
Right.
formal neutrality are the same justices who are least likely to oppose a law like the one in Edwards. Can you carve a majority together to use that formal neutrality to overturn the law in Edwards? I agree with you. I think certainly you could use neutrality to do that. I guess the question is more of a practical one. Is can you cobble together a majority of the court to do that in 2021 with a law like the one in Edwards? I mean, I think it's possible.
Right.
And of course, you know, we'll talk about American Humanist later, and another video. Endorsement theoretically might not be gone, but it may be like lemon, where it's there, but it's very rarely used unless you get the stars to align in the right way.
Right. But perhaps neutrality with accommodation, right, which seems to be the flavor of the month, might do it. But in the absence of that, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. The case is now much shakier than it was when it was decided, because the rug has really been pulled out conceptually out of this, what had been the heart of Establishment Clause jurisprudence, whether you liked it or not, but it's been pulled out to some extent.
Yeah,
Right.
I agree. I mean, I think, you know, I think a lot of times in U.S. constitutional law, I've sort of when I've taught con law, I kind of point out, you know, just because something is the least shitty option doesn't mean it's not a shitty option.
Right.
Right. And so, you know, the US Constitution may be one of the best in the world, maybe it's not, but that doesn't mean that any of them are ideal or perfect, right? And you can say that about the endorsement test. Of the various options that were out there for the Establishment Clause, I kind of have viewed it as sort of the least shitty option. And now it's kind of going away, but it's the least shitty option. That only leaves shittier options. I mean, I know it's sort of crass to say it that way, but that's kind of what it is. I mean, in that case, I don't mind being crass, because the endorsement in cases involving public schools was a very useful and effective, although very far from perfect, approach.
And it was, although we'll have some more discussion about that, but we'll take that as our last word on this. Join us again when we begin looking at, I think next time we're going to go from here to ceremonial deism and custom and tradition, which is one of my personal favorites. So we look forward to our next conversation. Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you all for listening. Stay tuned, and I hope this is some value.
Bye-bye.